Today, we are honored to be joined by Professor Joseph Massad, who is a professor of modern Arab politics and intellectual history at Columbia University. He is the author of several books, dozens of scholarly articles, and more than hundreds, even maybe thousands of the op-eds. We are also following his op-eds at Middle East Eye, which are also very much related to current developments in the world. And his books include Colonial Effects, The Making of National Identity in Jordan, The Persistence of the Palestinian Question, Desiring Arabs and Islam in Liberalism. His new book, The Age of Independence, A Global History of Settler Colonialism, is forthcoming from Princeton University Press. We are also waiting this book, Professor. So when is it going to be published?
It's not clear, not before next year, I'm afraid. It takes time,
okay.
Yes.
Yeah, and he's a recipient of a number of research and teaching awards, including Lillian Trilling Book Award for his book Desiring Arabs, the Scott Nearing Award for Courage Scholarship, and the Columbia University Faculty Mentoring Award. His works have been translated to more than a dozen languages, including Arabic, Turkish, Chinese, Persian, French, Italian, Spanish, and we are going to also translate one of his books to Turkish. Professor Massad is also a regular columnist in English and Arabic at the London-based Middle East Eye and Arabic 21. Our guest today is also a scientific committee member of the World Decolonization Forum, which is initiated by Institute Social and will be organized on 11th and 12th of May here in Istanbul at Atatürk Cultural Center. And this year's theme of World Decolonization Forum, decolonizing knowledge production and circulation. And dear Professor Massad, thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
I'm honored to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's our honor and pleasure. And before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce the purpose of the Colonial Voice Series before the World Decolonization Forum. Because this initiative aims to bring together leading scholars from diverse disciplines to deepen the discourse on decolonial thought. Specifically, we seek to contextualize emerging discussions on the decolonial consensus, or perhaps the decoloniality of the consensus, by comparing them with other global frameworks. While the Washington and Beijing consensus are well established, we are now witnessing the emergence of new paradigms. The London School of Economics published the London Consensus recently, which focuses on social resilience within the capitalist system. And we also here at Institute Social discuss very much about all these concepts, and we agree on that there is a Tel Aviv consensus as well, which also inspires, triggers, signals a return to 19th century colonial structures and persistence of the settler colonialism. So even these policies of the Tel Aviv is affecting other countries and igniting conflicts in the world. And at the same time, there is a Moscow consensus because the security-oriented foreign policy and security policies are dominating the world as well, as we understood from the defense expenses of the countries. Amidst these competing frameworks, our objective is to explore the maybe utopias of the non-Western world, to discuss about the colonial consensus and maybe spirit of Bandung, or should we, and what would a truly decolonial consensus look like in practice? And in our Decolonial Voice series, I'm always starting with the personal question as well, Professor Massad, because for the many of our audience and our colleagues here in Turkey, decolonization is like, the half a century before case during the 1950s and 60s, and there isn't any case of the decolonization or the colonization. But I do also want to discuss colonization and decolonization in our personal life. That's why my question would be for you, Professor Joseph, reflecting on your academic career in the United States. Do you believe that the influence of colonialism still persists within the process of knowledge production in the United States and the West at large? And also, another question about the non-Western world. Do you think the colonial thing is so powerful, or non-Western world is also very much depend on Western academic process and scientific knowledge production process? Floor is yours, Professor.
I'm not sure this is a personal question. It's more of a political, analytical question, and I'm happy to answer it, of course. Well, I mean, in the United States, of course, the knowledge production has always been influenced by the very structure of settler colonialism, which the United States maintains, of course, after 250 years of independence, right? And this year, this July, the U.S. will be celebrating the foundation of its country, which is the first white supremacist country on earth by law. And it's the first country that brought about the concept of independence as a political principle, which of course did not exist before, but which came to inform many settler colonies afterwards. So that is an important point to always bring up, that settler colonialism, in fact, enables concepts like independence, enables nationalism, enables self-determination, if not even national liberation, or at least liberation, as I can perhaps talk about later. So in that sense, the settler colonial foundation of the United States are very much inspirational to and inform much of sort of knowledge production. I remember, of course, on a personal note, when I first arrived, as a late teenager, when I finished high school in Jordan and I came to study in the United States, how surprised I was. This was in the 1980s when we were still in the throes of the Cold War, and not that we've an American anti-Soviet, anti-communist propaganda which persists until today, many decades after the fall of the Soviet Union. But at the time, I remember quite distinctly how taken aback I had been by my American political science professors, who would tell us how in the Soviet Union, academics are subject to state approval for the research, and that the universities are, of course, publicly owned, etc., and how this somehow limits research or perhaps censors it. I mean, they probably used a lot more hostile language to describe knowledge production in the Soviet Union. What shocked me, of course, was that American intellectual production has always been also informed and funded by the United States government or by private institutions that are really outshoots of American corporations. I mean, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, all of these are actually foundations that are sort of allegedly philanthropic, so that all the profits made by the Ford Company or the Rockefellers, etc., gets redirected through these foundations to control knowledge production in favor of American imperial capitalism, even if the committees that they put in charge, especially in the last maybe 50 years, seem to be, to advance certain kinds of liberal imperialist ideas. Nonetheless, much of the research, if not all of the research in the United States that is funded by private or public institutions has to accommodate the acceptable and accepted mainstream political ideas and economic ideas. So on a personal level, I have never received any funding for research for any of my books.
So there's a relation of colonialism and your personal story as well, Professor.
Well, there is in a sense, but I mean, I had never applied for funding actually. So the only thing that funds my books really is my salary at Columbia University, which of course, the salary itself comes from funds that are donated to Columbia by private institutions that are also subject to the same agenda, or even public institutions which fund the research. However, because my research is not directly funded, but rather my salary is, I am able to write and publish things that generally would not get funded. My book before last, Islam in Liberalism, a friend of mine recommended that I apply to two major funders, one private and one public, for the book. And I was not surprised, of course, that I was denied funding for it. So in that sense, now, of course, there's, other levels of control of knowledge production, and that happens at the editorial level. So at the editorial level, of course, which publishers will publish you or which will not. There's perhaps slightly a larger political spectrum of accepted knowledge production in different sort of presses, especially academic presses, that allow for certain ideas that are not. But sometimes there's also a consensus not to allow certain kinds of books.
Yeah, but Professor, because at the same time there is a consensus of the, let's say, the neutrality of the liberalism, while you highlighted that there is a liberal imperialism in your speech as well. So, because the first inception and understanding of the Western academia, which is very much neutral in comparing with other countries. So, can you speak a bit about this neutrality?
I don't know. I mean, you probably are referring to a positivist objectivity, what is claimed to be objective. Of course, I mean, people who are critical of positivism methodologically, and this would include many American academics sort of on the left, even if at the end of the day, they seem to rally around liberal solutions, even to radical ideas. I mean, I have many colleagues and friends who consider themselves on the left and often would put forth radical critiques of existing structures of rule in the United States on a variety of issues, whether it's gender, race, colonialism, etc. But at the end of the day, even their radical political critique ends up providing more of a liberal solution at the end that is in line with general liberal ideas propagated by the mainstream in the United States and Europe. So in that sense, even those who consider themselves on the left in the American academy often are, very much continue within the mainstream ideas and try not to challenge them when it comes to providing solutions to problems for which they gave radical criticisms. So that's another issue. But of course, imperialism has always had, perhaps its mainstream has always been liberal. After all, in the 19th century, it claimed to want to civilize the primitives around the world, non-white peoples. So the idea of having a civilizing mission was, of course, a liberal idea. This is not a conservative idea. Conservatives are not interested in civilizing the primitives. They just want to subject them to rule without having them, quote unquote, civilized. So this idea of a mission civilisatrice by France, but also the British followed something very similar, is precisely a liberal idea. After World War I, we see this idea moving toward the idea of granting colored peoples around the world a form of independence or self-rule, subject to the supervision of the white imperialist countries. After World War II, we have even a more liberal idea of trying to market neocolonialism as a quest for democracy, liberal democracy, if you will. And of course, after the fall of the Soviet Union, or even before, the quest for allegedly instituting so-called liberal human rights around the world became the major project as well. So imperialism has always been a liberal project in this sense, rather than a conservative one. Unfortunately, sort of propagators of liberal ideas seem to sometimes propound this inaccurate, I guess, depiction of imperialism as something that is not in line with liberal ideas. That is, of course, utterly untrue.
Yeah, thank you. And also, my next question would be about your main expertise. And you published several books about Israel-Palestine Question. And how does the Israel-Palestinian case complicate dominant narratives of 20th century on decolonization in world politics? Because there's an overwhelming assumption that colonialism largely receded after World War II and gave way to sovereign state-based international order. So, but there is an exception of the Israel-Palestine. So what do you think about the whole this process in world politics?
I don't think just Palestine complicates the stories. but many other aspects of or similar situations complicate the story. I mean, yes, while Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and Kenya were able to decolonize between 1956 and 1963 as settler colonies. I mean, the issue here, of course, is that, not only Palestine, but all settler colonies that survived decolonization in the 50s and 60s complicate the narrative, right? So Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, and Kenya all were settler colonies, were able to decolonize between 56 and 63. But still, after 63, you still had Rhodesia, South Africa, Mozambique, Angola, Namibia, Northern Ireland, Palestine, New Caledonia. Since 1994, with the final fall of the South African apartheid regime, even though economic apartheid remained in South Africa, but political apartheid was removed in 1994, we still have the last remaining settler colonies in Asia and Europe, namely Northern Ireland, New Caledonia, and Palestine, in addition, of course, to the major white settler colonies of Canada, the United States, New Zealand, and Australia, all of whom still refuse to grant economic and political self-determination or the restitution of land stolen from their indigenous populations. So the question of settler colonialism, I think, very much upends this idea that after World War II, colonialism ended. We should remember that colonialism, actually, direct colonialism, since the 19th century, did not last even, a quarter or half as long as settler colonialism. The system that has lasted the longest after Europe conquered non-European territories has been settler colonialism, not direct colonialism. Perhaps the longest direct colonialism might have been India, and even that, really, it was between in the 18th and 19th century, maybe a century and a half, but we now have over 4 centuries or more of settler colonialism. It's really settler colonialism that has survived, that has persisted, and has been the most resilient European system of subjection around the world. And it is a model that has been followed since then. So Palestine is merely a major example, but merely one of these many examples of the persistence of settler colonialism since World War II. And given the fact that it is perhaps the last settler colony in Asia, in addition to New Caledonia in the South Pacific and Northern Ireland in Europe, they do stand out aside from the white settler colonies of Oceania and North America. The problem of Latin America, of course, continues. Remember, we have today perhaps. The problem of Latin America is an issue because, of course, white supremacy became unsustainable as a result of the intermarriage between the white colonists and locals, which produced what was called mestizos in South America, or Ladinos in Central America, who are now, who rule most of these countries, except perhaps for places like Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. But even then, we have situations like in Bolivia and Guatemala, where the indigenous population is close to 50%, and yet, with the exception of Bolivia, where Evo Morales ended up being the first Native American president of the country, in Guatemala, the indigenous population faced genocide until, from the 50s through the 1980s, when upwards of 200,000 of them had been killed by a military junta supported by the United States and even Israel at the time. So all of these examples tell us that actually the post-World War II consensus on the end of colonization is quite inaccurate if we revisit the history of colonization as being more prominently a history of settler colonization. So while certain kinds of political colonization might have ended, though economic colonization never ended, after all, Kwame Nkrumah reminds us in his book on neocolonialism that the new order after the end of formal colonialism in the normal colonies never ended, because economic colonization continues and political control to a certain extent also continued. settler colonialism still, I think, is proceeding in a supreme way without
I see.
being undone.
So, Professor, you summarized not only Israel-Palestinian, but also the world history as well, in the perspective of the colonialism and specifically settler colonialism. So here, I think your question is very much related to Palestinian case in the context of the settler colonialism as well. Why? Because there are different perspectives to identify Israel-Palestinian case, because there are some perspective on the security, religion, nationalism, civilization. As you know, like 5 decades ago, the question was identified as the Arab-Israel war. So in the beginning of the 1920s and 30s, it was like only the Palestinian case because the Israel was like an emerging process because settler colonialism just started during the even late Ottoman Empire, but most significantly during the 1920s and 30s. So there are different identification of the Israel-Palestinian case. But for your perspective, not only Israel-Palestine, but also the whole world can be analyzed through the colonialism. Even the like not only last century, maybe last few, maybe 4 or 5 centuries. So based on that, how should we define Israel-Palestinian case? Settler colonialism or the other perspective are also so significant. And my other question, what are the conceptual and geopolitical stakes of adopting or rejecting the settler colonial lens in the broader study of global order?
Well, I mean, I think in general, settler colonialism has to be the main rubric through which Palestine, Israel, and the international order must be defined. And it has been defined as such since the 18th century, especially since the establishment of U.S. independence, which of course led to the independence of Central and South America, to the independence of Greece, but also attempts by white settlers in Southern Africa, in Canada, by the French settlers in Algeria, to do so. So, in my opinion, I mean, perhaps where I may differ with someone like Benedict Anderson, who told us some 40 years ago or more that nationalism came from the Americas to Europe, which I think is absolutely correct. What I would add to this is actually settler colonialism as the precondition and enabler of nationalism, enabler of the idea of independence, enabler of the idea of self-determination and national liberation, as I mentioned earlier, especially so because what you have in the American case historically, but it's, white settlers' demands for economic, not political independence initially. The white settlers in the United States who wanted to maintain or perhaps recover their own profits resented that they had to share their profits with the mother country. And mostly, as most American historians of the American Revolution attest to, the matter had to do with two issues. One was the issue of profits and taxes, that they had, all these increase in taxes and the profits being remanded to the British government in Britain. And the second thing was the increasing British limitations on territorial expansion at the expense of Native Americans by the white settlers, which the British wanted to control. Also, of course, the approach of ideas in the late 18th century of banning the slave trade, which the British were also feared by the Americans as considering as a possibility. So basically, the idea of independence, which did not mean what it meant for the Americans, except much later. So the idea, of course, begins from, perhaps the 15th and 16th centuries, but it didn't mean political or economic independence. Often it was used to indicate the secession of the Protestant churches from the Catholic churches. Later on, it would be used to refer to individuals as being of independent means, a kind of a bourgeois notion of new capitalists who did not rely on aristocratic inheritance, but made money through capitalist ventures. Until finally, for example, with the Swiss legal philosopher and historian Aimé de Vattel, that the Americans found sort of the concept of independence of a state that produces economic and political sovereignty more in line with their ambitions. So this idea of independence, which would become so important for anti-colonial nationalists, especially after World War I and certainly after World War II, begins as a white supremacist settler colonial idea that is very, very important in a larger way to establish their sovereignty. Now, of course, that the Americans were able to establish economic and a political independence at that time does not mean that it was replicable. Many other countries that tried to adopt the concept of independence were unable to establish economic independence, which remained within the realm of actually the British settler colonies. We will see how Canada, Australia, and New Zealand would be able to maintain economic and political independence, although in the case of New Zealand and Australia and Canada, they remained within sort of the Commonwealth of Britain. They established largely political and economic independence. Most of the other settler colonies were unable to. So the white settlers of Saint-Domingue wanted independence, were unable to get it. As a result of their struggle, you have a major slave revolt by the Africans and the colored population of Saint-Domingue, which produced the Haitian Revolution at the beginning of the 19th century, which unfortunately remained economically colonized by France through imposing on it a huge indemnity that has largely until today impoverished the nation and continues to impoverish it. Also, South America, for example, has not been able to achieve any kind of economic independence because the British, they were indebted to the British even after independence, and even though they established what was called political independence, they were unable to get economic independence. The only non-English speaking settler colonies that attempted that kind of economic independence, of course, were white South Africa and European Ashkenazi ruled Israel. South Africa was actually, and of course to a certain extent, white Rhodesia. They were not fully able to do so, although they tried, in a major way, especially South Africa, and to a certain extent Rhodesia after UDI in 1965. But the Israelis were unable to. They had to be sustained economically by the Americans, even if they were able to establish proper political independence to run their internal affairs, but not their external affairs. So, in large measure, we cannot see Palestine outside of the settler colonial rubric. We see, of course, an important transformation in world politics and in the concepts of how to fight colonialism and settler colonialism emerge in the late 19th century. So in addition to independence, suddenly this new notion emerges called self-determination. Mm-hmm. It begins, of course, as an important socialist principle
but it is the part of Wilson principles as well.
I'm sorry?
So the self-determination right is determined by the Wilson principles as well.
No, but it was a Leninist principle subsequently. It began as a socialist principle in the late 19th century, but also it was a principle that was adopted by the white settlers also, but what was called sort of the consent of the governed. So we see white South African settlers demanding a form of self-determination. In fact, this idea that Wilson would adopt at the end of World War I was actually the idea of Jan Smuts, the South African Afrikaner settler leader, who actually wrote many of these ideas that Wilson adopted. But of course, the concept had remained within the purview of socialist politics, from the Jewish Bund party in Tsarist Russia to the Russian Social Democrats and later communists, the major debates between Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, and Stalin in the first decade and a half of the 20th century, and then the emergence of this notion by Wilson after World War I. And of course, there was a huge difference between the Wilsonian and the Leninist principle. Lenin, of course, and the Soviet Union would immediately implement self-determination across the former Russian Empire and in the emergent Soviet Union by granting autonomy and independence and language rights and cultural rights across the Union, whereas Wilson, of course, insisted in his understanding of self-determination, which he, of course, announced as in order to compete with the communists and with the Russian Revolution after 1917, he insisted that what he called self-determination would only apply to the people of the defeated empires of World War I, not to the victors. So anybody living under French or British colonialism would not get a right of self-determination. Only those who lived in the former German Empire, the Ottoman Empire, or the Russian Empire could get that. So in that sense, there was self-determination was distributed equally by Wilson to the colonists or the settlers as well as the indigenous population. Whereas for Lenin was very, very clear that there was no place for great chauvinism, great Russian chauvinism against the natives or the indigenous populations, and that self-determination would be granted for those dominated by settlers rather than equally between the settlers. And so in that sense, self-determination, which begins also as a settler colonial concept, so that the Afrikaners of Southern Africa can get independence from British control, amongst others, begins to be adopted by the colonized as well, but through a Leninist definition. Lenin's definition, of course, was translated across the Arab world in newspapers after World War I. There was an attempt by the British to suppress it and close down newspapers that translated Lenin's speeches and declarations. And of course, while at the same time advertising the Wilsonian pro-settler understanding of self-determination simultaneously. And that carries us through, of course, because the Palestinians initially insisted on demanding independence at the Paris Conference in 1919. I mean, in 1918 and 1919.
So, Professor, indeed, we have several questions, and our participants wants to ask several questions as well. That's why. So, you summarize, I think, the settler colonial history. No, okay. Please continue. My question would be please start Israel-Palestine case just briefly to identify it, not from the 1919 Paris Peace Conference or the post-Ottoman mandate regime under the League of Nations. We want to know how to define this case, because when you open the newspapers, media, there are some Arab-Israel war or the Islam and the Judaism.
That is not new, you see. That is not new.
Yeah.
If you'll allow me just a very quick...
Of course, yeah, please.
Run through some of these. So the Palestinians demanded independence immediately and demanded self-determination in 1918, 1919 in their letters, an attempt to send delegations that were not allowed to go to Paris by the British, but they sent letters and petitions demanding both independence and self-determination. This idea would continue, of course, for the Palestinians up to the rise of the PLO after 1964 and after the rise of the Palestinian guerrilla groups in the late 1960s onwards. However, by the time we get to 1973, the PLO, under pressure from the conservative Arab governments, whose tutelage Arafat's Fatah began to seek, began to advance a new idea that rather than independence, rather than national liberation, that it sought a mini-state in the territories occupied in 1967, namely the West Bank and Gaza. So the question of independence was almost was revived in the 1980s, but on a truncated basis. So in 1988, at the PNC meeting in Algiers, in the fall of that year, they declared independence only of the territories occupied in 1967, namely West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Of course, I mean, it was a unilateral declaration of independence that was not recognized by Israel, although subsequently and more recently, several European countries decided to accept it. Now, the question of Arab-Israeli conflict or Arab-Israeli dispute, this is not new. This was always how, since 1917, the British propagated the idea that the question of Palestine was two national movements at odds with one another in Palestine, and there's an Arab-Jewish conflict at that time. So the idea, of course, and even interestingly enough, critical scholars would speak of these competing nationalisms rather than a settler colonial population imported from Europe to displace the indigenous population and an anti-settler colonial national liberation movement that fought them. So this is an important aspect. And of course, the reason why you see this consensus, even by critical scholars, is because of a commitment to a certain biblical racist European story that links modern European Jews, converts to Judaism, as somehow direct, biological descendants of the ancient Hebrews of Palestine. This is a very strange idea, you see. I mean, after all, European Christians who are also converts to this Palestinian Christian religion never claimed that they are descendants of the early Palestinian Christians. Somehow European Jews are reconfigured as if they are descendants of the ancient Hebrews. But this even, created a bit of a conundrum for the early Zionists. The leader of the settler colonists, David Ben-Gurion, back in 1919, along with a colleague of his, Ben Tzvi, wrote a book in 1919 that said, well, it seems to us that actually it is the majority of the Arab population of Palestine, the peasants who are 90% of the population, that must be the direct descendants of the Hebrews. After all, they kept the names of many of the old Hebrew names of the towns and the cities of their ancestors. So it turns out, ironically, by Zionist admission, that the Palestinians, according to them, are the direct descendants of the ancient Hebrews and not European Jewish converts. Now, of course, I find this biological genetic arguments Hitlerian in their pursuit of some genetic origin. But of course, at the end of the day, this idea, when I read critical scholars saying, including sentences in their critical account of Israel, where they would say it is the historical connection between European Jews and Palestine is indisputable. I don't know what that means. I mean, does this mean that the historical connection between Turkish Muslims, Ghanaian Muslims, and Malaysian Muslims to Mecca and Medina is indisputable? Yes, it's indisputable because Islam begins in those areas. And of course, we also know that many Muslim pilgrims, whether from Turkey, from Ghana, or from Malaysia of today, had come and settled in Mecca and Medina, and their descendants live there today. And we also know that many Arabs had gone out of the Arabian Peninsula and ended up in today's Turkey or in Ghana or in Malaysia. Does this mean that Malaysians now are of Arab origin and have an indisputable link to Mecca and Medina and should go back and set up their own state? It's a bit... if it were not such a serious matter, it would be laughable. These are not academic arguments.
And also, Professor, in your speech, you gave a reference to Benedict Anderson. It's in the imagined community.
Yes.
So it is imagined. It is, as you say, that it's like a joke in the historical studies. So it is incredibly hard to define European Jews' history indisputably part of the Palestine, and then it is going to give a legitimization of these policies. And also, I think you clearly identified the whole history in the context of the settler colonialism. But may I ask you, how would you critically analyze media, international institutions, academia to identify Israel-Palestine case? So specifically, just like a
interesting. This is what is interesting, is that all so-called solutions to the so-called Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Again, we don't speak of an Algerian-French conflict during colonization. We speak of the national liberation struggle of Algerians against the French. Only in the Palestinian case do we adopt this Zionist nomenclature, this Zionist idiom, that this is a Palestinian-Israeli conflict rather than Zionist colonization or settler colonization of Palestine and national liberation. So what you end up having is even, you have the BRICS, the United Nations, many people who claim to be on the side of Palestinian national liberation, supporting a fantastical thing called a two-state solution. This is the more radical position among these people. So what you get is the majority of all solutions, quote unquote, provided for Palestinians is to maintain Israel's right to remain a Jewish racist state within its 1948-49 borders, while granting Palestinians a mini-state in the West Bank and Gaza. But the idea of accepting Israel's right to remain a Jewish state is what is never questioned, right? That this is not up for negotiation. The European Union, the United States, even the BRICS, who support a two-state solution, basically are committed to maintaining Israel in its 1948-49 configuration as a racist state with, a motley of dozens of racist laws that run the government. Perhaps the law that was passed a couple of days ago of capital punishment for Palestinians who are accused of terrorism against Jews, but not of Jews who are accused of terrorism against Palestinians, is just the latest of these racist laws that govern the state of Israel. So in that sense, this endorsement by liberal academics, the liberal media, even the United Nations, which created this issue following the British Peel Commission of 1937, which suggested partition initially, all of those are committed to maintaining Jewish supremacy and racism in an Israeli state that they want to be confined to its 49 borders, while granting Palestinians a mini state that is, of course, demilitarized and fully under the rubric of American power, if it ever came to be. Of course, that's no longer on the agenda anyway, and therefore, in large measure, it is just a rhetorical solution that is often pushed by the League of Arab States and Arab regimes who pretend to be pro-Palestinian while working with Israel, but also by the BRICS and by the United Nations and others. So that is generally the media coverage, the even academic coverage. True, you have some slightly more radicalized views among some academics in the last 10 to 15 years who speak of a one-state solution, but they are unclear what it means. So is this a decolonized one-state solution where not only would the 70 racist laws that Israel has on the books or more be upended, but also the land would be redistributed to those from whom it had been stolen? So the idea is, will the Jewish citizens of the one-state solution lose their racial and religious privileges and become equal? As we know, equality, when offered to white European settlers, is a fate worse than death. Usually they leave immediately. When the Algerian national movement offered the French and white settlers of Algeria equal rights, they all left. They would only stay if they continued to have the racial and religious privileges in Algeria.
That's amazing, Professor.
Similarly, this happened in Tunisia. It happened in Morocco. It happened in Kenya. It happened in Rhodesia. It continues to happen in South Africa to the extent that South African whites have maintained economic supremacist, racist privileges, but still, because they no longer have the amount of political supremacist racial rights that they had before, many have chosen to leave. So this is a very interesting question to ask those who propound the idea that they support a one-state solution without telling us what that means.
Professor, you clarified the concepts and historical background, not only in Israel-Palestine case, but also in the different parts of the world. But the question is again about Israel and Palestine. So according to many journalists, academics, experts, politicians, let's say the bureaucrats in the international institutions, the question started at 7th October. So that's also another interesting question, because how might the events of October 7 be situated within the longer historical trajectory of conflict in Palestine? From the perspective of global political order, do they represent a rupture, a continuation, or a transformation of existing structural dynamics? How have they reshaped international alignments, legitimacy claims, and the language of resistance and security? That's why the question is about, is 7 October going to change international system, or This Zionist discourse says that 7th October caused all conflicts in the Middle East in Israel-Palestine. Please.
Well, I mean, remember, the Palestinian armed struggle began in 1935 under the British and under Zionist settler colonization. And it would continue until it was finally defeated in 1939. By then, the British had killed about 20% of all adult men in Palestine. Again, we see a reinvigoration of the armed struggle that begins in December 1947, after the beginning of the Zionist conquest, which begins on the 30th of November 1947. That is one day after the United Nations General Assembly adopted the partition plan. But also, of course, they were defeated along with the Arab armies who intervened in May 1948 only in the areas that were designated as a Palestinian state. The Israelis often lie and speak about being invaded by multiple Arab armies in 1948. That is actually untrue. First of all, the Arab armies intervened on May 15th, 1948 to stop the ongoing Israeli expulsion of over 400,000 Palestinians by then. By the end of the war, there'll be around 800,000. And also the attempt by the Zionists to take over parts of the geographic territories that the United Nations set aside for the Palestinian state. So, for example, the Jordanian army went in only in the area that was designated as a Palestinian state, except for going into East Jerusalem, which had been designated by the UN and under international jurisdiction. So they never invaded any of the area that is called Israel. So the idea that Arab armies invaded Israel rather than the Palestinian territories designated as a Palestinian state is one of the major propaganda lies that the Israelis often propagate. But at any rate, at the end of the war, the Palestinian armed militias were also defeated along with the armies. We see a very important attempt to retaliate against Israeli raids on Gaza in August 1955, after several massacres beginning in 51, 52, and 53 onwards by the Israelis to stem the tide and attempts by Palestinian refugees to return to their homes across the border. We have a major Palestinian Fidaiyin guerrilla group that begins to retaliate against Israel. That was a major raid that we had sometime in August of 1955, where the Palestinian guerrillas went as far as 27 miles inside the borders, the recent borders of Israel. They ambushed soldiers, they laid mines, attacked vehicles and buildings. According to the Israelis, 5 soldiers and 10 civilians died during that attack. Then, before the declaration of the armed struggle, so these were the attempts at armed struggle before the formal declaration of the armed struggle by Fatah in 1965. The end of the Palestinian armed struggle ends with the defeat of the PLO forces in Beirut in August of 1982, after the Israeli invasion of that country and murder of upwards of 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinian civilians. Then we see sort of the rise of Hamas in December 1987, along with the eruption of the first Palestinian uprising, or Intifada, which renewed the armed struggle, also by some of the constituents of the PFLP, of the PLO, including the PFLP and some elements of Fatah later on. So this would be the background to October 7th. And in the meantime, Hamas and the Israelis, of course, the Israelis continued to attack and bomb Gaza and kill hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. And then we have, of course, the ongoing exchange of hostilities in 2021 over the question of Jerusalem, and Hamas insisted on saving the Palestinians of Jerusalem from being evicted. This is, of course, after the PLO surrender in 1993 to become a collaborator with the Israeli government in preventing Palestinian resistance to settler colonization and to occupation, and a position that the Palestinian Authority, as a Vichy-style government, continues to uphold until today. So in that sense, the attack on October 7th was in a lineage of the Palestinian armed struggle since the 1930s up to this point. At least, it is seen as such by the Palestinians. It's seen as such by Hamas. It's seen as such by the Palestinians under occupation. As far as international alignments are concerned, as we know, the West and the U.S. have defended and continue to defend their last settler colony in Asia, to the tune of being willing to bring about a third world war to protect Jewish supremacy in Israel and the right of Israel to remain a racist state by law and by institutions. We see finally after the fall of the Soviet Union, the US and the West insistent on destroying international law, which had been sort of slightly changed after World War II to accommodate the Soviets. And because the Soviets insisted on certain changes, they were not always successful in doing so. For example, the Soviets insisted on including self-determination as a right in the UN Declaration. After 45, the US said absolutely not. As a result, the UN Declaration includes self-determination as a principle, but not as a right, which the Soviets had demanded. So we begin to see then international law, which begins, as we know historically, as a concept with the conquest of the Americas to adjudicate the way the conquest should proceed and how to deal with the indigenous populations, despite its usefulness for Europe and the US and as conquerors, but because of certain amendments that perhaps had made it illegal for Europe and the United States to launch certain kinds of wars or use certain kinds of weapons. All of that now has fallen by the wayside in support of upholding the Western values of white supremacy, even to the point of genocide, the insistence of the white Western world on dominating the globe economically, regardless of any kind of resistance or demands for economic sovereignty. So really, we are back in a situation that existed in the 19th century, but also until World War II. I mean, remember, the kinds of objections to the horrifying racist regime of Nazi Germany between 1933 and 1945, it's kind of strange that it comes from these Western European nations and the United States. We have to remember that between 33 and 39, the United States was a racist country by law, like Nazi Germany. All West European countries were still racist by law. Nazi Germany was not some maverick racist country that is questioning the liberal equality and universalism.
What do you mean, Professor, by law? Like, what was the definition?
The United States, of course, had racist laws to maintain segregation in the U.S. South. By law, it prevented Native Americans from becoming citizens until 1924 and of voting till 1948.
So when you mentioned this one, because I thought that the late Ottoman Empire, because before the modernization of the Ottoman Empire, the system was the millet system. So the whole nationalities, or how should we define communities, has their own system, legal system, and political, maybe we can say, because they have a head of the millet, head of their nation. And the empire, like a sultan, consider the head of the community as a representative of these people. So basically, during the 19th century, most of the European countries forced the Ottoman Empire to follow equal policies to all citizens. Even
which they themselves did not follow.
Yeah. So that isn't it quite interesting? So how do you understand?
It is ironic, of course, but this is the thing. Of course, Nazi Germany went farther than that between 39 and 45 by committing outright genocide, which the Americans had committed earlier in a way. Although there would be, other genocides that the European colonial countries would continue to commit, whether mostly in their colonized territories rather than in Europe. So really, as many have pointed out, especially anti-colonial intellectuals like Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire and others, that really the objection to Nazi Germany and to its racism is that it targeted, in addition to non-white people, it targeted Europeans. And its main victims in tens of millions were Europeans. That basically the kind of genocides inflicted on non-white people were and remain irrelevant to the Europe that condemns the Nazi genocide because of its racist commitment. So all I'm trying to say is that, it's not that you had European countries and the United States that believed in universal rights and was an actual democracy when the Nazis were in power. Nothing of the sort was actually happening. On the contrary, what you had at the time are all these European, West European countries and the United States being equally racist, or at least certainly institutionally racist and legally racist, as was Nazi Germany. I mean, the Nazis were actually horrified as their jurists were preparing the Nuremberg laws of 1935. They came to the United States to learn from the United States about their Jim Crow laws, and were horrified that in the United States, one drop of black blood makes a white person black. They thought that was just too racist. And this is why in the Nuremberg laws, they insisted that someone is a Jew if she or he has more than one Jewish grandparent. So it was a very different even definition. It was less stringent than the American racist definition of what makes a white person or a black person. So at any rate, the point of all this is to say that the international system today has gone back to that kind of commitment, the kind of language we hear from European or American officials on the question of European values or, et cetera, are being re-articulated in the racist manner that they had been articulated with back in the 19th century, if not before.
So my last question, and then after that we are going to start the Q&A part. Okay. So my last question would be about decolonial consensus, as I mentioned in the beginning of my speech. So looking forward and taking into account our conversation on colonization, decolonization, and non-ending colonization process in Israel-Palestine and the other parts of the world. So, and the rise of multipolarity in world politics, do we think there is a room for a decolonial consensus, or should we rather speak of decoloniality of the consensus, because consensus itself bringing universal and very much, let's say, the hegemon perspective. So there are some critics on the concept of the consensus as well. So which element would help or hinder the realization of the decolonization and decolonial consensus in the world?
I don't think there's a decolonizing consensus, let me put it this way. After all, many countries that had formerly been colonized celebrated the end of political apartheid and the maintenance of economic apartheid in South Africa in 1994. They celebrated the fall of the Rhodesian racist regime in 1980 while maintaining fully the white settlers' right to continue to steal the land and own the land that they stole during settler colonialism. So, and of course, the consensus on Palestine. I mean, I think the absence, for example, of an active role for the BRICS in opposing the recent American-Israeli attack on Iran or on the abduction of the Venezuelan president, Nicolás Maduro, makes it clear that the attempt at an economic alliance between these varied states is not a basis for an anti-imperialist or an anti-colonial or let alone a decolonizing consensus. Even though, of course, the BRICS bloc did issue statements condemning Israel's targeting of civilians in Gaza, but they also, of course, support the imperialist and settler colonial so-called solution, a two-state solution for the Palestinians. Of course, this is a far cry from the position of movements that had called for decolonization and for an anti-colonial politics. For example, the League Against Imperialism in the 1920s was far more radical in its demands and in its statements about this. Certainly, by the time we get to the Bandung Conference and the Asian African Consensus, we continue to have more and more attempts at an anti-colonial politics that continue to be reaffirmed by the non-aligned movement in the 60s and the Tricontinental Conference in Havana in the mid-1960s, or even the last attempt in the 1970s to establish a new international economic order by many of the decolonized countries, which also failed. because of the refusal of the imperialist countries to grant any aspect of economic sovereignty to the third world. I should perhaps mention here that when the ambassador of Chile in the 1950s insisted at the United Nations that countries in the third world be granted economic sovereignty, the American ambassador accused him of using hate speech. So it's very important to remember that actually
just for the economic independence, yeah.
yes, of course.
Sovereignty.
So resisting American or European pillage of your economic resources is a form of hate speech as far as the Americans and the Europeans ruling regimes are concerned. So as a result, we see, of course, a major, the United States, along with Britain and France, were insistent on preventing any attempt at economic independence. The CIA brought about a coup d'etat in 1949 in Syria when the elected Syrian president at the time refused to allow the Americans to build a pipeline of petroleum from the Arabian Peninsula to the Mediterranean. In 1953, they overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh, the prime minister of Iran, for nationalizing the oil, the benefit of Iranians. We see this, of course, also continuing subsequently with the attempt to destroy all welfare state, the coups against Sukarno and the CIA coups against Sukarno in 1965 Indonesia, in 1966 against Nkrumah's Ghana, in 1964 against Goulart in Brazil, back in 1954 against Arbenz in Guatemala, or even, of course, Allende in 1973. Any attempt at economic sovereignty has been fought by coups, overthrowing of regimes. And of course, finally, once the welfare state began to be destroyed at the instigation of the Reagan administration in the 80s within the United States, the struggle already to destroy welfare states, which had begun in the 50s and 60s, reached a new level. So if they defeated Nasser and his welfare state in Egypt through Israel in 1967, and certainly by co-opting Sadat to the American agenda as opposed to the Soviet side, the dismantling of the welfare state became a very important goal of the colonial powers, of the imperial powers. So we see this, perhaps the latest, the attempt to destroy Venezuela and Cuba as remaining welfare states now is continuing precisely because the neoliberal order can no longer tolerate it. What you end up having, if the Americans get their way, and which is what they hope they can, and it seems that they miscalculated. By eliminating Iran from the equation, they would then help the United Nations, or rather the European Union, but also the Western powers, maintain Israel's right to remain a racist state without any threat. I think the current war against Iran is a continuation of the war on the Palestinians since October 7th. Iran's major sin has to do, it has a number of sins as far as the West is concerned, but a major one is its ongoing support of resistance to Jewish supremacy in Israel and Jewish settler colonialism in Palestine more generally. So as a result of its support for resistance movements against Israel, it is seen as a real and veritable threat to the survivability of the Jewish supremacist settler colony, and has to be removed from existence since Western Europe and the United States are all committed to maintaining Israel's right to be a racist state no matter what happens. So you see a number of these elements come together to decide sort of the situation today. China and Russia remain on the sidelines, unfortunately, of this. True, they have, rather than oppose some of the United Nations resolutions on Gaza or recently on Iran, they abstained, hardly an oppositional move. The BRICS have not even issued a statement on the American-Israeli aggression on Iran because of major disagreements between their separate constituents. So I think it's very difficult to have a decolonizing consensus among states Now, among intellectuals and among social movements, that would be a different story.
Thank you. And still, as far as I understand your speech, the colonial consensus is far, far, far away from the real politics right now. So the colonization is so strong, even today. And also today, maybe we can speak about the maybe Palestinian case, Palestinian cause is the cause of the world, who are defending the dignity of the human beings. And the interesting one, as far as I understand from the whole story about settler colonialism, who are settled and who had the independence, who were the victim of the system, but they are becoming the part of the system as well, like the Jews indeed were the victim of the European racism, and currently we are witnessing the settler colonial history who are causing the same politics. And when I look at the questions in our chat box, one of the questions is about the Iran war, but you briefly summarized your perspective about Iran war as well. I will start the one question from the Gabriela Iba. And before that, several of our scientific committee members are here with us as well, like Professor Alexis Wick, Professor Nadia Abu Zahra, Professor Fernanda Miguel, Dr. Eskander Abbasi, Professor Solomon Marx, and thank you for joining us today as well to listen to this conversation. And my question would be the Mrs. Gabrielle Ibba. Few years ago, Professor Massad, you were the audience of the conference in which Jeff Halper was speaking. He started his intervention saying, I am a settler and I am here to stay. This from a scholar that claims to be an anti-Zionist. It is often easier to deal with a scholar openly Zionist than someone often cited even in academic works on Palestine. It seems there is a denial of many scholars, even those that seem fighting injustice, to recognize that decolonization is not a metaphor. As Tinan puts it, it is about land restitution most importantly. How would you deal with this more subtle way of colonial mindset?
Yes, I remember. I was actually a participant in that conference. I gave the opening speech at that conference. And then when Jeff Halper, who's not a scholar, by the way, he's an activist, but also, worked in documenting settler activity, was speaking. Yes, I remember being unhappy with several of his remarks, mostly not because I think as a settler he should not stay after decolonization. Of course, he would stay with stripped of racial and religious privileges, and he would be granted equality with the natives. I think he might be open to this, although I was a bit incensed when he suggested that the struggle about what to name the country after decolonization, and he suggested that it should be called Palestine, but the latter part of Palestine would be spelled Stein, which is in line with the last names of many Ashkenazi Jews. To which I objected, and I said, it's very interesting that you are still committed to the equal rights, quote unquote, of Ashkenazi Jews at the expense of Sephardi Jews who are in Israel, whose last names do not end with Stein, Stein. So it was a bit of course, an offhanded remark on his part and on mine, but it was a revealing remark from his on his part that he still seemed to think of the Jews of Israel as just the European Ashkenazi Jews whose name or claim to have anything to do with Palestine should be maintained after decolonization. So yes, the issue, of course, would have to be about a full restitution and decolonization. And of course, the settlers, I think most of them will leave because they cannot accept equality. Like I said, it's a fate worse than death for them. If we judge from what happened in Kenya, Tunisia, Algeria, Rhodesia or Morocco, amongst others, that's what actually happened. So, but those who decide to stay and accept equality, of course, should continue to live in a decolonized country. That's without a doubt. But let's see, if that ever happens, if they would accept it or not.
Thank you. And there's another question from the Zehra Salsal. So she's very much thankful to your speech, and many of the audience indeed very much inspired as well. So basically, her question is about South Africa. South Africa is often cited as the most successful case of internationally supported decolonization. Yet, decades later, systematic racial inequality and economic segregation persist. If the most favorable conditions still produced an incomplete decolonization, is there a structural condition unique to the Palestinian case that could either prevent or reproduce the same outcome?
I don't think there is such a structural condition. You are right that the South African case, as I had mentioned, the deal that Nelson Mandela and the ANC had made is a deal wherein they would, the international, the imperialist countries, so-called international community, would allow South Africa, and it only allowed it, of course, after the fall of the Soviet Union, because the concern all along was that it would become a socialist country allied with the Soviets if apartheid were to have ended before 1991. But once the Soviets fell, they allowed a new deal with the ANC and Nelson Mandela. And let us remember, the ANC had always been a liberal institution ever since it emerged. In fact, the Communist Party of South Africa was far more radical in the 20s and 30s than the ANC. The ANC was radicalized after World War II as a result of the workers' movement in South Africa, which increased in leaps and bounds as a result of the increase in the number of the African proletariat in South Africa. But of course, it had an important competitor subsequently, which was the Pan-African Congress, right, the PAC as well, which was a lot more radical in its demands. But the ANC remained liberal in its demands and remained committed to the equality of the white settlers with the coloreds, Indians, and the majority African population, except that that was not acceptable to the United States and Europe. The only thing that was acceptable was sort of what happened in the US South by the late 1960s and the 1970s, which is ending official political apartheid, the price for which would be the maintenance of racist economic apartheid, which is exactly what ended up happening. So like in Rhodesia between 1980 and 2000, in South Africa since 1994, the South African government cannot touch, and also, by the way, in Namibia, that was the condition of the independence of Namibia in 1990, that the ill-gotten wealth and lands owned by the white settlers cannot be touched by the post-apartheid decolonizing country. So as a result, in South Africa today, we have more poverty than we had in 1994. The white rich now live in gated communities with, instead of apartheid government security guards, you have now private security guarding their gates. And they continue to derive the ill-gotten profit that their ancestors and parents had derived over the last 3 centuries from South Africa. Palestine would not be any different. Remember, the Palestinian bourgeoisie and the business class had always been happy to sell out the rights of the majority of the Palestinian peasants and the poor. They tried to do this already in the 1920s. The Palestinian bourgeoisie and the landed class in the 1920s was sort of divided into 2 kinds of classes: a minority that collaborated with the Zionists and the British to gain a favor, especially from the British mandate, and a majority of those landed elites that collaborated with the British, but not with the Zionists, against the Zionists, claiming that by collaborating with the British, they had a better chance of influencing British policy toward the Zionists. As we know, of course, they also collaborated with the British against the rise of the Palestinian resistance movement and the rise of the Istiqlal Party in Palestine in the late 20s and early 30s, which they opposed as a competitor. The Istiqlal Party in Palestine was actually a party of intellectuals and workers. And it staged major demonstrations that were repressed violently by the British with the support both of the Zionists and the Palestinian elite. In 1935, when the Palestinian guerrilla movement was launched, its leader was killed during a fight with the British. Izz ad-Din al-Qassam, when a huge funeral was staged for him, attended by the poor and the peasants and workers of Palestine. All the Palestinian elite refused to actually participate and absented itself from his funeral. So this is an important thing. In the 1950s and 60s, the Palestinian bourgeoisie, until the early 60s, was reluctant to actually participate in any national program for the most part. Things would change in the 60s as attacks on Palestinian capital, the Intrabank in Lebanon, the restrictions on educated Palestinians to travel and work in the Gulf, the civil war in Jordan, all of that convinced the Palestinian bourgeoisie that it needed the rubric of a state to protect its capital. And so it convinced, of course, the Arab regimes with whom it was and remains allied to recognize the PLO in 1974 at the League of Arab States as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians. Of course, in exchange for the PLO pledging not to support revolutionary movements in the Arab countries that threatened Arab regimes, whether in Oman or in Bahrain or elsewhere, or in Morocco for that matter. So what you ended up having is a commitment by the PLO to stop being a revolutionary group and fight Israel for the kinds of goals that were set after 1973, which is establishing a mini-state in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. So, but we do see, for example, some former Zionists who are now pretending to support the one-state solution have written articles, and I've written in response, saying that, encouraging Israeli Jews to support the one-state solution, reassuring them that, like white South Africans, Israeli Jews would remain economically prosperous after decolonization. Of course, what that means is that they're saying, you should get a similar deal as in South Africa. If the major issue is the maintenance of economic supremacy for the Jewish settlers, then they can do so within the rubric of a one-state solution. So that is being actually proposed. Not that I think it's practical or it's being followed on in the short run, but who knows? But no, I don't think there are structural impediments. On the contrary, I think the Palestinian bourgeoisie inside the West Bank and in the diaspora is determined and has shown its determination to sell out the rights of the majority of the Palestinians in exchange for a semblance of a mini-state that within which it could operate and its capital could be safe.
And I think we spoke many things, but at the same time, Professor Massad, everybody is speaking about theology behind of this word.
About
theology.
Yeah,
theology. But you haven't mentioned anything about it. Do you think theology is still part of this conflict or not?
I mean, I think white European and American supremacy is a very Protestant type of supremacy. It's also an evangelical supremacy. Even the idea that I mentioned earlier that critical secular scholars still believe or insist that European Jews have a so-called indisputable historical link, not spiritual or religious link, but a historical link to Palestine, is actually informed by these evangelical Christian Protestant supremacist ideas that they want to subjugate the rest of the world to believing in, or at least accepting as universally applicable. So, and we saw, I wrote actually, in the last month, a couple of articles on how redefining the United States as a Christian supremacist state under Trump is proceeding, in leaps and bounds. Of course, this is not new. We know that, they, of course, Secretary of State and Secretary of War, Hegseth and Rubio, or Rubio and Hegseth respectively, as well as Trump, have spoken outright about the whiteness of the United States and its Christianness. But again, it's not new. This goes back to, the foundation of the United States as a Christian white country. This is a white country by law. and its commitments to Christian Protestantism was institutionally sort of preserved throughout the 19th and the 20th century. Its hostility to Catholics, let alone to Muslims, would continue, as we saw, but also after World War II. I mean, in an attempt to fight Soviet communism, you have President Eisenhower in the 1950s getting baptized while in office into a Protestant Christian denomination, insisting on printing the expression "in God we trust" on American currency, insisting on adding the word "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, where now it says "one nation under God," insisting on inaugurating the so-called National Prayer Breakfast, which is a Protestant prayer breakfast. So the theological aspects of the United States, even Wilson was thought that God had mandated for him to carry out his mission during World War I and afterwards. We're speaking about a country that is suffused with religiosity. Reagan and even Clinton spoke about being evangelical Christians. President Obama often reminded us how he prayed to Jesus Christ every night and how the blood of Jesus Christ will save him and us. So we're speaking, this is not a Trumpist innovation, you see. But yes, so the theological question of white Christian supremacy is indeed one that has been maintained in the United States, but also in Europe, and especially in the France that claims to be committed to laïcité, which I think everybody else outside of France sees as nothing but a hypocritical joke, given the institutionalized racism and anti-Muslim discriminatory practices of France, let alone its anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish history and collaboration with the Nazis against its own Jewish population, which of course has now been rewritten in France as France having been a major resistance to the Nazis when the majority of its political forces and its population in fact had collaborated with the Nazi occupiers and handed over their Jewish population to the Nazis. So again, the theological question in that sense on the Christian aspect of this remains very much alive and with us. And of course, we were told even, as this war began, how Hegseth told his troops that this is going to be the battle for Armageddon, you see, for the end of the world. So this is the way they structure their theological understanding. How is this just rhetorical? Is this just ideological, or is it a basis for political decisions and economic decisions? I think there's an interplay, even though I think, of course, the economic and imperialist aspect of these decisions are the primary ones, and theology is weaponized to bring them about.
Thank you, Professor. There are several other questions about Iran war. I think we spoke a bit about that, and also there's a question about Al-Aqsa and religious theology. And I want to read Bilal Bar's question. It would be our last question, Professor, and we have just a couple of minutes, not much. So how could resolving the Israel-Palestinian conflict reshape ideas of decolonization in settler colonial studies, given the competing claims of both Israel and Palestine to the same land?
First of all, I don't call it the Palestine-Israel conflict. I call it the anti-colonial Palestinian struggle against the settler-colonial Zionist movement, and that is important to remember. Also, the so-called claims by the two sides are not equal claims. The settler colonists are making a claim to steal the land of others, whereas the Palestinians are making a claim to the land that they own and of which they're being dispossessed by thieves coming from Europe, if you will. Yes, the fact that this is all dressed up in a kind of a nationalist settler colonial rhetoric is not unique to Israel, you see. I mean, remember, the idea of a return by European Jews, quote unquote, to Palestine is actually borrowed from other European colonial endeavors. When the French colonized Algeria, they claimed they were returning back to the Roman lands and that this is their country, and that the Arabs of Algeria are the real colonists of Algeria, while the European French invaders were indigenous. When the Italians invaded Libya to make it into a settler colony as well, they claimed they were returning to Roman lands, that this was not really, invading a foreign territory. Again, they saw themselves as indigenous to Libya because it was part of the Roman Empire. Even when the Nazis invaded Eastern Europe and were on their way to Russia, they claimed that this was actually all in ancient German lands where the Germans had lived. So the Zionists were really not being original in claiming that European Jews are returning to Palestine. This is a claim made by all European colonists in the Arab world and elsewhere, you see, but especially, in North Africa, where there were 4 settler colonies, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and Libya, and in Palestine. So again, it's nothing really new. So settler colonial studies already does not weigh the Zionist claim to Palestine equally with the Palestinian claim, understanding that it is not different from white settler claims to the lands of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, or the Maori of New Zealand, or the Kanak of New Caledonia, or Native Americans to the United States, or First Nations to Canada. And therefore, I don't think settler colonial studies would change, because only mainstream liberal social science might, in some instances, give equal claim to the oppressors and the oppressed in a Wilsonian fashion and in an anti-Leninist understanding of self-determination.
Thank you, Professor. And as you know, there are some theories about the human beings, the originality of the human beings, and there are some explanation that we all derived from the African continent. So maybe one day people would say that we have a right in Africa, or Africans are going to say we have the right in the world. So there isn't any it is endless conversation.
It's actually more comical than this. You find sometimes pro-settler colonial historians of New Zealand talk about the history of human colonization of New Zealand. So basically, if New Zealand was empty and then humans came to it, that kind of settler colonization, as far as they're concerned, is the same as the white settler colonization of New Zealand after the Maoris had been living there for centuries. So stealing the land of the Maori is equivalent to taking over empty land. So this is the way sometimes this alleged that all humans are settler colonists is used to justify white settler colonialism in the last 4 to 5 centuries.
Yes, you're right. Thank you very much, Professor.
It was a pleasure.
For this enriching conversation. And thanks to all participants who are joining us and contributing conversation today. We look forward to welcoming you in the upcoming sessions of the Decolonial Voice Series on our way to the forum. So our next Decolonial Voice would be on 8th of April with Professor Ann Norton from Pennsylvania University. And on 10th of April, we would have I should check, Nadia Abu Zahra from Ottawa University. And in 11th of April, we would have Professor Jo Gang-in from Fudan University. Have a wonderful day for all our participants and Professor Joseph Massad. Thank you.
Thank you.